Welcome to OULive. My name is Rabbi David Pardo. Tonight we begin commemorating Yom HaShoa, Holocaust Remembrance Day, observed on the 27th day of Nisan, the anniversary of the uprising of the Warsaw Ghetto. Jews around the world remember and commemorate the murder of 6 million Jews during the Holocaust. There are, thank God, still many ways to remember, commemorate, relive. I highly recommend joining us tomorrow for a program with Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, the former Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Israel, who's also the youngest survivor of the Buchenwald concentration camp. He's going to be speaking for us tomorrow live, 11:50 a.m., 10 minutes before noon, together.ou.org. If you just navigate to together.ou.org, you'll find that program as well as all the things that we're doing throughout the week for the general public. I'd like to introduce my guest at this time, Dr. Shay Pilnik. Dr. Pilnik is the founding director of the Emil and Jenny Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Yeshiva University. Prior to that, for the past 5 years, he's been the executive director of the Nathan and Esther Peltz Holocaust Education Resource Center. Shay, how are you?
Rabbi Pardo, David, how are you doing?
Dr. Pilnik. Such a pleasure, hopefully under different circumstances. I want to start out. You're really a bal davar. You're really an expert in this field. A question that I had, and I think a lot of other people have also, which is what exactly is a center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies? We're not talking about a museum. We're not talking about a professorship. What does it mean for a university to start a center?
What it means for a university to start a center at the very core is to be able to train the next generation of educators and leaders in the field, both professional and lay leaders. This means that the Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, which was facilitated through a gift of Emil Fish and Jenny Fish, may she rest in peace, intends to offer a master's degree and a certificate for teachers that would train the next generation of educators and leaders in the field.
So we're talking about a series of courses and building a full package for Holocaust studies.
At its very core. So the core would be programs that would award degrees in the field. But beyond that, the center will do its best to reach beyond the ivory tower to the greater community with teacher training workshops, with webinars, with public programs. Public programs can be lectures, they can be live interviews with Holocaust survivors, they can be exhibits, theater plays. The goal would be to make sure that the Holocaust, which I see as a complicated topic, difficult, tragic, painful to grapple, both on the cognitive and the emotive level, on both of them, to make sure that the public, with particular emphasis on young people, would be sufficiently educated about the subject.
So that's one of the questions I wanted to ask you about. It's been over 70 years since the Holocaust. American Jews have invested a legion amount of effort and money into Holocaust studies and have built Holocaust museums. You'll tell me in exactly how many states in the United States of America. And I grew up next to one of the big ones, the Simon Wiesenthal Center. Has Holocaust studies been successful? Meaning, what was the goal? Was if it was to avert more genocides? We haven't done that. If it was to avert antisemitism, at least in this country or really in any other country, we haven't done it either. What were we striving for? Was it successful? And what does it look like looking to the future?
Great question. The
It's a
64
really
million
hard question. I'm sorry to dump it on
right.
you.
We've been awfully, no, that's great. We've been awfully successful and awfully unsuccessful. And it really depends on the objectives that we set for ourselves. First of all, Holocaust education centers, I would say, and it's very core on character education. We also have to point out that Holocaust education is both for Jews and for non-Jews. Jews, I believe, do have a different obligation to remember the history of their people. But I, as a grandson of survivors, so first of all, an introductory editorial comment about myself. My Holocaust education was not a standard one. Maybe it was standard in some circles in Israel. I always say that my Holocaust education began when I was 5 years old, when I learned that my grandfather lost all of his siblings during the Holocaust, that my grandmother was taken from my parents, and a few weeks later, a few months later, they were actually taken to a pit, to a ravine, and they were shot. They were machine gunned by the Nazis and their collaborators. The subject always intrigued me. I think that myself, not in an unusual way, came to the topic through a very personal connection. Sometimes when I actually work with non-Jews, and you would think that they are just history buffs who come to study the topic, you find out that they also have a personal connection. All too often it may be a grandfather who liberated one of the camps or took part in World War II. I think that if you dig, deep down, you will always find a personal connection, because Holocaust education is about developing, cultivating the character. So I first of all define it as an area within the realms of character education. At the end of the day, Holocaust education prompts us through a study of a chapter in history, a historical chapter, to understand human nature and to be able to make better moral decisions. Now, Holocaust education, its purpose is not only to make us be better people, but at its very, very core, I would say that the maxim of all Holocaust museum and Holocaust institutions is never again. It's the idea that if you go through the educational process, you become more committed to making sure that this is not going to happen ever to the Jewish people. You will not be either a victim, God forbid, a perpetrator or bystander to such a calamity. And on top of that, I would say by extension, this is not going to happen ever to any group of human beings. So of course, Holocaust education has many different flavors and contexts and, as we say, shitot or shitas. But at the very core, it's about moving you by through the educational process to be a better person. So when you ask me about success, yes or no, I would say that in character education, what we do is first of all maintenance. And we don't have a control group that we can look at and say, hey, look at these children and these students. They never learned anything about the Holocaust. And look, they are about to commit, God forbid, the next genocide or the next Holocaust. So when we do maintenance in education, we sow seeds. We don't necessarily see the outcome and the flowers that are going to grow from or the fruits from the seed that we sowed. I can share with you more anecdotally personal experiences that working in Wisconsin for 5 years, I have met students who chose to do a master's degree in Holocaust Studies, or chose to go to law school, or chose actually to become managers, directors, leaders in their community. And when you ask them, why did you make this choice? They said, I remember as an 8th grader, I had a Holocaust survivor who came to my class and spoke for 45 minutes. Also, if you think about your or our middle school education, what do we really remember from our middle school education 20 years later? We don't remember, the algebra classes, at least not in my case. The geometry, English, We remember a little bit of the details, but if we had a guest speaker, a Holocaust survivor, I remember Israel Parikman, the math teacher in our school, who was a Holocaust survivor. I'm in my early 40s, so I got a chance to interact with survivors who were in their 20s and 30s. Today, most Holocaust survivors who speak to students are child survivors. They survived the war as either teenagers, as we say today, or as young children. I vividly remember the testimonies of Holocaust survivors that I met throughout my life. So Holocaust education provides this powerful moment that I think remains with people. Now, at the same time, so we're awfully successful. You mentioned before, you wanted to ask me how many Holocaust museums or centers are, and I don't know, I would estimate them by the dozens. There is an association of Holocaust organizations, which is an umbrella institution for all of these organizations. We're talking about hundreds of Holocaust organizations, centers, museums around the world. There is recognition today that the topic is important. Almost every community in the United States would like to have its Holocaust museum. I heard a story about a Holocaust museum in a mall right next door to a nail polish. The person who told me about it said, you know what?
Nail polish? Like a
Yes.
nail?
Rabbi Pardo, that's right. And the person who told me about it said, you know what? Maybe that's the Holocaust museum that should have not happened. But I think that, in a way, there cannot be too many of them. They all show recognition. But I also said that we're awfully unsuccessful. Awfully unsuccessful in the sense that one would think that with this plethora of Holocaust educational institutions around the country and around the world, young people would be knowledgeable about the subject. We would be able to ask college students the most basic questions about the Holocaust, and they would be able to answer them. And there's plenty of indicators. I will mention the Shown survey conducted by the Claims Conference back in 2018. There is also a video clip that went viral of students at Penn State University and University of Pennsylvania and other colleges in Pennsylvania being asked the most basic questions about the Holocaust, not being able to answer them.
Complete ignorance, right?
Ignorance, we're talking about 41% of millennials who think that we're talking about 2 to 3 million Jews. We're talking about 49% of millennials who would say that, who cannot name a single concentration camp out of the 40,000 constructed by the Nazis and their collaborators. We are struck by the level of ignorance. There is certainly plenty of indicators that something about Holocaust education is broken insofar as the ability to communicate this subject, particularly to young people, is concerned.
So you are now starting a center, and how we have it. I hear that we are building people's characters and morals, and that it's hard to measure. We haven't averted subsequent genocides. How are we doing things different now going forward? And if something is broken, what are you doing that's different?
I think that what I recognize as broken, as the remedy or how to fix what's broken, is first of all to acknowledge the fact that we will not be able to fix it within one day, and also create this one-stop shop, one-size-fits-all solution to the program. Holocaust education has a variety of approaches. The approach that YU is going to adopt is teaching the Holocaust through very specific lens, particularly through Jewish lens. We see the Holocaust primarily as the Shoah. The Holocaust, just to give you like a quick background, is a Greek term that talks about being burned.
Olah offering.
the OULive, victimization by the fire. Shoah, by the way, is a biblical term that refers to a natural disaster, like a flood. It wasn't a natural disaster. The victimization there wasn't burnt offering to God. But Shoah is, in terms of branding, is a label that is exclusively associated with the suffering of Jews during the Holocaust.
Yeah, but
The
what is
Holocaust,
a Shoah, like you said, in biblical terms, is not immoral. Meaning, when a tidal wave comes, it's calamity, but it's not
not man-made. It's not
not
man-made.
man-made, and therefore not immoral in the same way, or maybe at all. But so how?
It suggests that there's no real term that would capture the magnitude and the depth, I would say, of this experience. The Yiddish term is churban, or churban, destruction, referring to the destruction of the first and the second temple. So this is like the dritter churban, the third destruction. It also doesn't capture the magnitude because this was not a temple that was destroyed, but rather an entire people. I think that our program is going to focus on the Shoah in a much more blatant way in comparison with other Holocaust centers or Holocaust museums. The Shoah and the Holocaust, the relationship with them is complex. First of all, we have to understand that the Holocaust is an experience that means and should mean a lot to humanity, not only to Jews. First of all, when we analyze genocide, we have to remember the term genocide, the destruction of a people, was coined during the Holocaust. And second, virtually all scholars of genocide would agree that the most extreme genocide that has been experienced in the modern age, maybe even in history, in human history at large, is the Shoah, is the Holocaust. So the Holocaust does have some universal components. We as Jews must be able to recognize these universal components and the fact that for a lot of people around the world, suffering, the dehumanization, brutalities are associated with the Holocaust. And the Holocaust, by the way, broadly defined by, for instance, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, that's not a Jewish institution, that's a federal institution, is defined as the state-sponsored targeting and victimization of not only Jews, but also the Roma, the Jehovah's Witnesses, people with mental disabilities. Shoah is a reference to the
Specifically Jewish destruction.
anti-Jewish genocide perpetrated by the Nazis.
You know, I noticed something. Did you see? Yeah. No, did you see Hunters? I know this is a big topic amongst
I heard of. Somebody told me it's not so great, so I haven't seen it yet.
mixed reviews, not the time, but it's very clear that they didn't have any consultants, that they didn't bring in consultants. I'm assuming because all the writers were Jewish, so they're like, we don't need consultants. And there's some things, there's so many little things are just like so maddening, like that they walk into a shul in Brooklyn in the 70s and they're using art scrolls that wouldn't be published for another decade. Or that someone's sitting Shiva and a woman walks out and she walks out, she taps the guy on the shoulder, says, Baruch Hashem. She's like, come on, you could have hired a consultant. And whenever they refer to a number, the number is 11 million. And I was like, never. Jews in Brooklyn in the 70s, I don't care, religious, not religious, wouldn't say 11 million. Right?
So 11 million is it's a great point. By the way, I heard that in the movie The Ten Commandments, there's one Israelite that's standing with a Breitling watch, that kind of keeps up.
Right.
Yeah, pops up.
Maybe that's because they did have consultants.
Your point before about Art Scroll in the 70s. 6 million, 11 million really shows you the point I was bringing home before.
About universalism versus
11 million is not
particularism.
the real number. 11 million is a number conjured up by Simon Wiesenthal. Simon Wiesenthal wanted to find a way to define the Holocaust or redefine the Holocaust that would ensure that it continues to be appealing for Jews and non-Jews. And that's how he came up with this perfect formula of 6 million Jews and 5 million non-Jews. We do not know the number of people non-Jews who were targeted by the Nazis. If you talk about victims of the Third Reich, listen, there were 27 million Soviet citizens and soldiers combined who died during the war. But if you compound the number, for instance, the Roma, the Gypsy, the more appropriate term would be the Roma and the Sinti, we think that we're talking about between 250,000 to 1 million. We don't really know the numbers. Nobody has ever did a serious study of the victims of the euthanasia program, Freemasons, Jehovah's Witnesses, the political prisoners, the Soviet prisoners of war. So I think that Wiesenthal came up with 5 in order to give the Jewish Holocaust, the Shoah, its primacy, 6 versus 5. But the combination of the number 11 frightens me. So I wanted to say a few words about that. Because I think that Holocaust education and Holocaust remembrance has a future only if we do manage to keep this balance of the Holocaust's universal aspects that I touched upon before, and its Jewish aspects. So what I said before is, understandably, people are always going to refer to the Holocaust. It is going to touch people all over the world. And, they may sometimes confuse one group of victims of the Nazis and others, but they would look at Hitler and this grand program of destruction that he came up with. If what remains of the Holocaust in terms of memory in 20, 30 years is only this vague memory that there was a dictator, a ruthless dictator named Hitler, and he killed people, human beings, 11 million human beings, this would be an incredible, I think, insult and injustice, particularly done to the victims. When we think about the history of Native Americans in this country, we don't want to study this history just for the sake of studying the, I would say, negative effects of colonialism. When we study the history of African Americans during African American history, we don't just want to come up with this general moral lesson about how bad slavery is, slavery of all sorts, slavery in the Roman Empire or the Mesopotamian Empire. In other words, I think that when you study a very dark and painful saga that pertains to the history of a people, you have to study it with respect. You have to study it by paying attention to the details and to the experiences of the victims. Not only to see, for instance, in the case of the Holocaust, to see the Holocaust as a grand program of brutalization of a people, to study how the SS is moving from one town to another, rounding up people and shooting them, but also to study the experiences through diaries, through the memoirs of survivors, through materials sometimes, by the way, hidden during the war, through portraits, reportage, created by the victims. So YU, for instance, is going to have a center. We are a Holocaust and Genocide Study Center. I do not think the word genocide is not valid. I think that when you study, talking about character education, when you engage in a deep study of the Holocaust, it makes you already committed to all other genocides that happened later and also to preventing genocide. But in order to do justice to the subject and to the victims, you have to study it, as we say in Latin, as sui generis. In other words, as a genre, as a type in and of itself, without just universalizing it. I came upon an article in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel a couple of years ago. I was so upset, I gotta tell you. It was 70 years ago, today, 70 years ago, today, 73 years ago, a story about a girl, Anne Frank. She's a high school student from Holland, a Dutch high school student who was hidden by she was hiding during the war, and then she was discovered and taken to a Nazi camp. No mentioning of the fact that she was Jewish. Also, when we think about Anne Frank, so again, when you talk to me about what's broken in Holocaust education, too much emphasis on the very powerful, compelling story of Anne Frank's attempt to survive and murder. Anne Frank was a Jew from the West. She was in hiding, hidden by non-Jews in Amsterdam. The centerpiece of the Holocaust, its epicenter, is Poland. In Poland, we had 3.3 million Jews before the war, and 92% of them, about 92%, were murdered during World War II, during the Holocaust. Most Jews experiencing the Holocaust are not in hiding. Their fundamental experience, for the most part, is being taken from the ghetto, being put on a train, in a sealed train car, and being deported to a death camp or an extermination facility, in which they would be dragged off the train and be killed within a matter of an hour by poisoning with lethal gas. So again, I think that we have to recognize the fact that the Holocaust has the capacity to change lives and change worlds and hearts, that the Jews in the non-Jewish world, humanity at large, is always going to be intrigued by the subject. But this must not be done at the expense of understanding that the Holocaust is intrinsically a Jewish experience. The Holocaust, to me, is primarily the Shoah. I think that if we look at the experiences of other victims of the Nazis, they are different. Adolf Hitler, in his first essays, his first letters, in Mein Kampf, is not rambling on and on and on and on about how much he hates the Jehovah's Witnesses, for instance. Clearly, the Holocaust ties into the very DNA, the very deep tissues of the Jewish people, in terms of our existence in Europe, our existence as a people in that part of the world for 2,000 years. The Holocaust is tightly linked to the story of anti-Semitism, both the medieval and modern anti-Semitism and during antiquity. And from everything I described to you here, I think you can see that there was a critical need to establish a Holocaust Center that would highlight these point of views. That doesn't mean that we are going to make all millennials now be able to recognize more than one camp. And if you ask me, the survey shows that they cannot name a single camp. If they could name the word Majdanek, if they could recognize the word Belzec or Sobibor, would that make Holocaust education of different quality? Not necessarily. And our focus is going to be educating teachers, educating future educators. I would, for instance, love to also work with young people who will be in the future lay leaders of boards of Holocaust centers and Holocaust museum across the United States. For me, this is a part of a very deep and personal battle to shape Holocaust memory for the next couple of decades.
So let me ask you a question about what you've been talking about, the tension between universalism and particularism around the Holocaust, and also people who are watching should read your article in Tablet, where you play out this your internal struggle actually through your career, and how that's transformed you. I staffed a March of the Living as a trip rabbi, and it was a strange experience for me personally. A, it was my first time to Poland, but B, I was there as the rabbi to other people. So I was there for myself, I was there for other people. C, I'm a grandchild of survivors that D, I never met. They died before I was born. So I grew up with the Holocaust. I don't remember when I learned about the Holocaust. There was no moment. It was always there, but I never met the people. And I found the trip in so many ways. It wasn't a frum trip. It wasn't an Orthodox trip. The messaging of the trip I found to be very, I don't have to say, not all over the place, but a lot in conflict. You know, the March of the Living trips they go now. So you spend Yom HaShoa, you spend in Birkenau, and then you spend Yom HaTzmaut in Israel. So maybe the message of Israel is like, we should have gone to Israel. But then you meet people in Poland who are trying to rebuild life in Poland. So the message is we should stay, and we should, strength and winning is staying and rebuilding, not going to Israel. And then on the way to the march, on the way to Auschwitz, watching a video from a trip called the March of, I think it's called the March of Faith and Remembrance, something like that, where they take non-Jews on this march. The March of Living is specifically a Jewish trip, and they take non-Jews on a trip. And everyone goes around and says, why am I marching? I'm watching this video as I'm going to the camp where my own Bubby, for the first time, recreating my Bubby's experience when I never met. And these people are going, I'm marching for, this marginalized group or this oppressed group, and this woman says, I'm marching for all the Palestinian victims of Israeli brutality. I'm like, this is wild. Like, she's on a trip being funded by Zionist Jews. I am marching for the Palestinian children who are victimized. And I realized in that moment, the Holocaust is so big, it's so massive, that you can kind of stand on top of it and pitch your message. And she can walk away from this and say, the message of the Holocaust is that we have to resist Israeli tyranny. Then certainly, there's all these other messages that are in conflict. And, Fackenheim's 614th commandment ruled the day for American Judaism for so many decades. It was the go-to phrase. So, to sum up, how are we supposed to walk away from the Shoah? What is the enduring message, or how do we deal with this tension, with these competing messages? Do you have thoughts on this?
Yes, I think that the memory of the Shoah, like any memory, is both political and politicized. We have to make sure we do our best to understand its usability. And also understand that it may one day, if we're not careful, be used against us, against the Jewish people. For instance, the example that you just brought up. The Holocaust can be used against grandchildren of survivors like you and me, with, for instance, BDS, pro-Palestinian propaganda, only if, and it can be effective, only if society at large, I think, is not informed about its core components. So first of all, the Holocaust is in my opinion, the victimization of the Jewish people. It's a program that never happened before, never happened after. And unlike all other destructive programs, what was unique about the Holocaust was the idea devised by Adolf Hitler. It really came up in his mind that the world should be completely cleansed, completely expunged of one group of people, the Jewish people. So the intent of the Holocaust was very different from either genocidal activities that happened both before and after the war. Hitler never really intended to kill Jewish engineers, Jewish intellectuals, Jewish communists, for instance. Zionists, that was not the intention. The idea was that everyone, once he reached the definition that you are a Jew, according to Nazi racial science and racial law, you committed the crime of being Jewish, a very severe crime, and you should not exist here anymore. This is why also we see a difference between the way the Nazis target Jews and non-Jews during the war. Going back again to my comment about the Holocaust and the 11 million as a term that I think can be fairly misleading. You asked me before we talked about Shoah or Holocaust. I'm comfortable using the Holocaust, but as soon as I start to teach the subject, I immediately refer to the Shoah. And I do it with a great deal of respect, for instance, to the Nazi targeting of the Roma population. The Roma, by the way, do have a term called paremos that denotes their own Shoah. And I actually think that we as Jews do have an obligation to study the targeting of other people. But the Holocaust cannot be misappropriated. I would, by the way, prefer that the Holocaust, sometimes people feel that when you study history, what's history? It's studying the past. There's a great deal, I think, today of underestimation, disrespect towards the field of history. People want to know what's the practical value of it. I had actually a lot of people who told me, listen, Shay, don't be a scholar, don't be a historian. You are going to a school than talk to the children about what they need to do with this information tomorrow. And that's a very problematic thing. So I would say it's problematic for somebody to light a candle, and maybe we shouldn't even go into it, light a candle at Auschwitz because of the so-called Israeli brutalities that you mentioned before. But at the same token, when we talk about the Holocaust as a way to understand bullying in the playground, when we talk about the Holocaust as a panacea for domestic abuse, when we talk about the Holocaust as a way to learn how to do conflict management better, that to me is a problem. So here I'm talking to a rabbi, and I think that I can, as a part of this dialogue, conjure up the difference between lishma and shelo lishma, Torah for its sake and Torah not for its sake. I am, as a Litvak, I am a big advocate in Torah lishma. And I think that Holocaust studies should also be recognized lishma, and from lo lishma, we can also come to, actually, from the study lishma, we may be able to understand the ramifications of shelo lishma. And I will explain that, first of all, we have to study the history. We have to study the specifics. We have to study the context of the Holocaust, the geographical, the historical one, the pre-war, the Weimar years, Jewish life in the ghettos, Jewish life in the camps. We have so many. For instance, we're going to offer a course at YU in our program about rabbinic responsa during the war, which is a fairly, the reaction of the Orthodox community, which is a fairly neglected subject. I think that once we give enough respect to the subject, we are going to be much better at understanding how it can be used. And I personally would not recommend to apply it too quickly for any practical purposes. That to me is not a way to give proper respect to the subject. If I can make another comment about the trips that you mentioned, they tend to be all over the place, but they are also very powerful and highly recommended. I have worked, I've led a number of student trips to Eastern Europe, to places of the Holocaust. I think that it's a mistake on the part of a leader to expect students to walk the grounds of Auschwitz and get out of the gate. Normally, like when you get to Birkenau, right outside Birkenau, there is actually a coffee shop. I was actually pretty stunned. There's umbrellas with a Pepsi logo on the umbrellas, and people are actually buying drinks and buying souvenirs. Don't expect people to come out of Birkenau and tell you this 1 hour tour there changed my life. All too often, it starts to sink in and to dawn on the participants, sometimes weeks after the trip, sometimes years after the trip. But I led a trip 4 years ago and 2 years ago, and in communications with the students still, I see how impactful that experience was in making them, having them make life-changing decisions long term.
It's Yom HaShoa today. People are watching now, what's one thing that people should do or take away or commit to or spend time on today?
I would recommend to try to think about the Shoah as one individual Jew multiplied by 6 million. For me, maybe it was easy to do it because I grew up with survivors. You mentioned your deceased, the Holocaust survivor grandparents that you didn't know. I was fortunate to know mine very well. My grandmother died at the age of 95 just a few months ago. I think that we have plenty of resources to listen to testimonies of survivors. Yeshiva University, by the way, has a fascinating project called NNN, Names Not Numbers, that interviews Holocaust survivors as an experiential learning project for high school students. You're welcome to take a look at that project or go to Eyewitness or on YouTube. I would say, do yourself a favor and listen to a testimony of one Holocaust survivor during the 24-hour duration of Yom HaShoa.
Dr. Pilnik, thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for sharing.
My friend, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you, Shay. And thank you to you for joining this incredibly important conversation. I'd like to again encourage you to join us tomorrow, 11:50 a.m., 10 minutes before noon, together.ou.org, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau speaking about bearing witness to history. And remember our obligation not just to those who perished, but to those who survived. We remain here. We are here for a purpose, and we have an obligation to that purpose. Stay healthy.